Welcome to the RSAA. Today, we turn our attention to Xinjiang. In recent years, China's policy towards the Uyghur people in Xinjiang has caused deep concern around the world, and particularly vocally in Western countries. China's policies have led to new political and trade frictions and have cast a shadow over the Beijing Winter Olympics. The issue would probably be more prominently in the news were it not for the more imminently threatening crisis over Ukraine. But in this remote and culturally distinct region, 2,500 miles from Beijing, the Chinese government perceives a threat to its security, to which it has responded with measures widely perceived as disproportionate and resulting in some governments speaking of genocide. Our objective today is to better understand how China interprets the political and cultural character of Xinjiang, how that relates to the state's prioritization of Han identity and CCP rule, and why China considers the measures that it is using appropriate. And so we are avoiding, at least to an extent, debate about the label genocide, not out of squeamishness, but because it does not in itself help us to understand the CCP's motivation and actions. Another catch-all word, in this case favored by the Chinese government, is terrorism. And there again, the word seems to be used in a way that obscures more than it illuminates. I hope that today our panel, who bring long experience and deep expertise, can give us a better understanding of Xinjiang than we might get from media headlines. Martin Purbrick, who is moderating today's event, is well known to many in the RSAA, a regular contributor to our journal Asian Affairs and commentator, particularly on Hong Kong and the East Asian economy. I will leave the introduction of speakers to him, but please welcome our panel, Professor James Millward, Dr. Zhang, and Dr. Pablo Rodriguez-Merino. Martin, over to you.
Thank you very much, Michael. I'll just give a few introductory words, if I could, and introduce the panelists in a little more detail. So thanks, Michael, also for choosing the title. I think Liberty and Safety in Xinjiang, a zero-sum game is certainly appropriately diplomatic, but also open-ended enough because it is a very complex subject. It's an area, of course, that the Royal Society for Asian Affairs has been involved with since its inception. And I think many members will know Sir George Macartney was the British Consul General in Kashgar from 1890 to 1918. And he arrived in that city as part of an expedition led by France's young husband, who was, of course, one of the founders of what was then called the Central Asian Society, now the RSAA. So I think there are many people in the RSAA who have traveled through that region, understood it for their own experience. So what we'd like to do today is talk through the issues with this panel and try and understand the complexity a little more, especially as there are many competing narratives about the history of Xinjiang and what's happening in Xinjiang now. And just to introduce that, I'd like to just give two very brief quotes. Firstly, from a white paper from the State Council of the People's Republic of China in September 2021. And I quote, lying in northwest China and central Eurasia, Xinjiang has been a place inhabited by multiple ethnic groups since ancient times. In 60 BC, the Western Han dynasty established the Western region's frontier command to govern the Xinjiang area, officially incorporating the area into Chinese territory. Let me just remind you of the date, 60 BC, according to the white paper. Over the following 2,000 years and more, various ethnic groups have emerged, divided and mixed there. Today, they live together in harmony and have formed a diverse unity. Work to remedy the backward economic and social situation in Xinjiang began immediately after founding of the People's Republic of China in 1949. The population of Xinjiang, particularly its ethnic minorities, has grown fast in size and quality, and life expectancy has seen a substantial increase. And then I go on to later in the same white paper, and I quote again, in its fight against terrorism and extremism, Xinjiang has established vocational education and training centers in accordance with the law. There is no essential difference between these institutions and de-radicalization centers and community correction, transformation, and disengagement programs in many other countries, unquote. And obviously the PRC State Council publishes many white papers, which I think are always worth reading, to understand what they wish to project to the world. But then cutting across really quite a different perspective from the US State Department in July 2019, and I quote, "We're deeply alarmed by the highly repressive campaign against Muslims, including Uyghurs, ethnic Kazakhs, Kyrgyz, and members of other Muslim minority groups in Xinjiang. We're particularly concerned that the Chinese government has detained more than 1 million individuals in camps since April 2017, where they're subjected to re-education. In these camps, the Chinese government requires individuals to renounce their ethnic identities and religious beliefs and refrain from prayer and other cultural and religious practices. We've received many credible reports of deaths in custody, allegations of forced labor, torture, and inhumane conditions." So obviously there are very different narratives about the history of Xinjiang and what's happening in Xinjiang now. And I think it falls to scholars especially to look further and more deeply than the newspaper headlines, as Michael said in the opening. So joining us for this discussion, firstly, we have James Millward, Professor of Intersocietal History at Georgetown University. And Professor Millward has written and studied Xinjiang and the region for a long, long time. And I'm very grateful because I've used his books in some of my papers for a degree at St. Andrews a few years ago. He follows and comments on current issues regarding Xinjiang, the Uyghurs, and PRC ethnicity policy. Following James, we'll have Dr. Rodriguez-Merino, I apologize, who's a senior lecturer in the Department of Defense and International Affairs at the Royal Military Academy, Sandhurst. He's previously taught at Birkbeck University, University of Warwick, where he earned his PhD. And if you look through to his online research, many papers on the subject of Xinjiang and what's been happening there. And finally, Dr. Zhang, a British Academy postdoctoral fellow at the University of St. Andrews, where we've met previously in a webinar. Her research and publications broadly within security studies, especially her work with the Center for the Study of Political Violence and Terrorism at St. Andrews, as well as constructivism and Chinese political philosophy. She has a PhD from the University of Leeds, a master's degree from the School of Oriental and African Studies. So I think three scholars who can bring a lot to this debate. So James, perhaps if we could open with you to give us a bit of a broad overview of the subject itself and bring us up to date. How do you think Xinjiang came to be in this situation from its history? How has the status of the region during the Qing and the Republican and now the communist periods of government changed? And what do you think is happening at the moment? So it's rather a broad question, but
yeah.
Take us through your views. Thanks.
Well, thank you for that introduction, Martin. And I must say, just to begin with, I feel rather humbled to be addressing an organization who had Young Husband and McCartney as members. We're sort of steeped with history already here from your introduction. You also mentioned the white paper, the recent white paper that begins its discussion of what's going on in Xinjiang today, as you mentioned, in the first century BC, right? So in the Han Empire. So I think all of that is completely irrelevant, and this is probably one of the biggest differences between how and I would say many in the West look at the history and how the PRC narrative attempts to integrate or to use history to make its point. So, I believe Britain was an outpost of the Roman Empire around the same time that Xinjiang was an outpost of the Han Empire. Some anti-Brexit forces might in fact have brought that point up, but they didn't. So this kind of points to different ways in which we try to use history in this situation. I'd like to start my very, very brief historical review at a different point in time. The early 20th century, and point out a conjuncture of several events in, I guess, the second decade of the 20th century. In 1912, the Qing Empire collapsed. In 1917, the Romanov, or the Tsarist Empire, collapsed. In 1918, of course, Austria-Hungary collapsed, and the Ottoman Empire fell in 1922. Now, we don't normally put the Qing in that group, but I think it's really important to do that, because really effects of the breakup of these great land empires, these very, very diverse land empires, were very similar. There was this explosion with a lot of ethno-national effects, a lot of scrambling to create new nations. And this was the same in the territory of the former Qing Empire. Mongolia and Tibet in 1912 both declared themselves to be independent states and both recognized each other. They didn't get global recognition. And of course, at the same time, really the largest and most successful secessionist movement in recent history in China, that of the Han seceding from the Qing Empire, resulted in the, after some time, creation of an independent Republic of China, republics of China, right? I'm being a little tongue-in-cheek calling that a secessionist movement, but within that context, the breakup of empire, that's really one way to look at it. And then in Xinjiang that we're talking about today, there were various groups over the next 30 years or so that declared and attempted to establish independent states. There was a Hui Muslim attempt, and there were a couple Turkic attempts, and one relatively successful one with Soviet sponsorship, known as the Eastern Turkestan Republic. So at this moment, then, in the early 20th century, after the end of the Qing, there was great debate among various types of Chinese nationalists, of Han nationalists, about what exactly was China, who were the Chinese. And some took a minimalist view that it was simply the former territory of the Ming Empire, which is much smaller than the Qing and does include all of these Central Asian territories. And only the Han people were Chinese, and that should be the new territory. But others took a maximalist view, and Sun Yat-sen and ultimately the Kuomintang and Chiang Kai-shek were among those. And they argued that Xinjiang, Mongolia, and Tibet were part of China and part of this new Chinese republic. But Sun Yat-sen pointed out, and it's quite interesting, he pointed out that they needed to be colonized. And he wrote in a book of his, he has a very famous book called The Three People's Principles. There was a companion volume there on development of China. And there he wrote a whole section, a program for colonization of Xinjiang and Mongolia. And he argued it would be very profitable. He was seeking international investment in this. And he wrote, if within 10 years we can transport, let us say, 10 millions of the people from the congested provinces of China to the Northwestern Territory to develop its natural resources, the benefit to the commercial world at large will be enormous. And he went on more in that vein. Now, the Kuomintang, that is the nationalist party that was struggling through the early 20th century to unify parts of China, really lacked resources to carry on any kind of colonial campaign in Xinjiang, and had no influence on the ground in Xinjiang until really the early 1940s. And meanwhile, besides various nationalist groups, the Soviet Union was supporting its proxies. Now, when Hitler invaded the Soviet Union, that gave the Kuomintang a chance to get back some influence there. And they managed to more or less establish a foothold in southern Xinjiang, while the Eastern Turkestan Republic was still in the north. And I'm sorry, Adobe Flash Player has chosen this moment to want to update. So I better get rid of this screen somehow. Let's see. There we go. My apologies. Okay. So what finally, there was a brief civil war, or a war, I guess, between the Eastern Turkestan Republic in northern Xinjiang and Kuomintang forces in southern Xinjiang. And really just before the Eastern Turkestan Republic was about to take over the capital of Urumqi, as the world approached the end of World War II, the US pressured the Kuomintang, and the USSR pressured the Eastern Turkestan Republic to patch things up over Xinjiang. And they established a kind of joint rule, a coalition government over what was then called the province of Xinjiang, with the former president of the Eastern Turkestan Republic, Etmetjan Kasimi, as vice governor, and a Kuomintang official named Zhang as the governor. So I've gone into a little detail here because in order to establish that relatively attenuated Kuomintang position in Xinjiang, they needed to follow the same kind of policies, pluralist policies that the Qing Empire had. So there were ethnic representatives. There was a multilingual kind of state. There was no forced Sinicization policies, and it was really a mixed and pluralist approach to governing in an imperial territory that was very diverse. Okay, after the Chinese Communist Party succeeded in defeating the Kuomintang, then in 1949, they moved into Xinjiang, and they did have the resources to actually begin to colonize this region. And interestingly, they followed exactly the same contours of Sun's plan. They settled troops, some 80,000 Kuomintang troops, and another couple, 20,000 or so PLA troops were settled there on farms, and with the slogan of a rifle in one hand and a pickaxe in the other, in order to begin the development of the region. And that was the seeds of what's known as the Xinjiang Production Construction Corps today, or the XPCC. It's actually Xinjiang Production Construction Military Corps. And I mention that because they are one of the main, they're kind of a state-owned organization on steroids, state-run organization on steroids, and they are responsible for a lot of the cotton growing. They also run prisons, and they run some of the camps, and they've been the target of some of the US sanctions. Now, in beginning this sort of occupation and development and colonization of Xinjiang, though, the Chinese Communist Party had what we would call today an optics problem. And basically, if they have taken over the territory of a former empire, how do you govern and colonize an empire without looking like a colonist? If you're a socialist communist state who is dedicated in the cause of anti-imperialism, how do you do this? And so the way to resolve the ideological problem that they hit upon was to create a system of minzu, or ethnic groups, or nationalities, as they used to be called, used to be translated in English. And this is the 55 nationalities plus the Han, making 56 in total. And then related to that is what's called the regional autonomy system. And that allocated supposed self-governance to several large territories in the PRC, Xinjiang, Tibet, Inner Mongolia being among those. And so what's interesting about this to me, along with things like special economic zones and the special autonomous region of Hong Kong and the concept of one country, two systems, right? This is a top-down administrative pluralist approach. It's not democratic pluralism, but it's a recognition that you can have different systems and different legal structures in different places to recognize their historical difference and ethnic differences and other things like that. And that is the system which worked fairly well in the 50s. It was quite popular among non-Han peoples in the 1980s. And that's what's been reversed in recent years. I haven't been paying enough attention to my time. Am I out of time yet?
If you'd like to bring us up to date.
Another couple of minutes, good, okay.
Yeah, go for it. Thank you.
All right, so then, of course, one of the reasons we're here today, and I'm sorry, my light keeps going off, they're very conscious about saving electricity here, and everything's on motion detectors. So if I don't wave my arms, I'm left in the dark. The region was beginning to be integrated into the PRC through the 1950s. In the Cultural Revolution, it was very unruly, and this Xinjiang Production and Construction Corps was among the most unruly elements there. In the 1980s, there were some student marches by Uyghur and other non-Han students in Xinjiang, as there were student marches all over China, of course, culminating in 1989 and Tiananmen occupation. In the early 1990s, there were some incidents that seemed to have been Islamic flavored. and discussion of separatist plans in a small uprising in a place called Baran in the southwest of the region. Later on in the 90s, there was a movement of self-help groups, men's and boys clubs with the soccer league that the state cracked down on and dissolved. And that led to a big march, which was then fired upon, leading to a riot and more events like that. So that was the Rojava incident, as it's known. And then for 10 years, from 1997 through 2018, there really were no major events or even relatively minor ethnic events or unrest like this that we know of, at least that were reported. Meanwhile, of course, 2001, with the 9/11 attacks, the US launched its global war on terror and used that as a rubric for US foreign policy. And very soon after that, in the first months of 2000, I believe 2002 it was, the PRC released another one of these white papers. And this marked a rebranding of all unrest in the Xinjiang region as terrorist, and in particular as related to Islamism, to jihadism. And that had not really been the vocabulary that they referred to it before. So we see the influence of this, of 9/11 here, even in Xinjiang like this. In 2003, the US listed a very small group known as the Eastern Turkestan Islamic Party that had a small base in Afghanistan. The US listed that as an international terrorist organization. And in its statement made a huge mistake, the US did. They took language from the Chinese white paper, which had listed a bunch of unrest, a bunch of actions in one part of the paper, and listed an alphabet soup of many different groups in another part of the paper, and never really connected who did what, never really accused any particular group of doing one thing. When the US listed the East Turkestan Islamic Party, though, it blamed everything that had happened in the previous 10 years in Xinjiang from the Chinese white paper on this one group. And it used exactly the same language lifted directly from the white paper. So as a result of that, then, this specter of an organized group that had committed many, many acts and killed hundreds of people was really created by the US putting its imprimatur on it. And this went into what Sean Roberts calls the terrorism industrial complex, and the think tanks kept churning this out. And really for some 15 years, this whole narrative about terrorism in Xinjiang was driven by that diplomatic error on the part of the United States. I am conscious of my time. There's more we can talk about specific incidents, but I should stop and let my colleagues speak.
James, thank you very much for being so diplomatic as well. But you've taken us through several hundred years of modern history, and even got the Romans in there somehow, which was pretty smart. So I think that was a great introduction. But it'd be nice to cut across to Pablo now to talk in a little bit more detail about the modern history of political violence in Xinjiang and what's been the reaction of the state. So Pablo, obviously you study this at Sandhurst and teach on the subject. Could you tell us more about political violence in Xinjiang from what James started to talk about, and the events post 9/11, and how you think this has impacted on the securitization of Xinjiang by the PRC authorities?
Sure. Thank you, Martin, and thank you, Michael, and everyone in the Royal Society for Asian Affairs for the invitation to join this panel, which I find a real pleasure in sharing with James and Che. Well, actually, I'm going to expand on what James has reviewed, the more contemporary era, if we want, of political violence. And I'm going to develop an argument that relates to the role that political violence has in explaining these dramatic measures, to put it in a mild way, that we have seen recently. When we consider the nature and the impact of the modern history of violence in Xinjiang politics and in China's securitization of the region and its people, I think that we could say that both phenomena, both the violence and the security politics, they have run in parallel, interconnected ways. However, I would suggest that it is not political violence that has somehow triggered or provoked in the first place the China's securitization of the Uyghurs, but rather the contrary. It is this securitization of Xinjiang that has had a multiplier, a causal, triggering, and even driving effect on the nature, first, of that political violence, and then on the actual intensity. So Uyghur violent unrest against the Chinese state or Chinese rule has been a constant in Xinjiang from the reform and opening era in the 80s to our days, obviously with different levels of frequency and intensity, but always we have seen in one way or another like some sort of violent unrest in the region. However, the ways in which the Chinese authorities have interpreted such violent unrest and reacted to it, they have substantially varied. And this has not been necessarily in reaction to the actual violence, but because of broader, I'd say, political considerations that include geopolitics, the ethnic policies of the country, notably and more recently those with a more assimilationist colonial pulls, if we want. So I'm also going to take a chronological approach to the question, but I'm just going to go through the 80s, the 90s, and then the post 9/11 period, which, as James has mentioned, really sets like a turning point in China's approach to Xinjiang. So when we think about the 80s, we have records of episodes of what we could comfortably describe as ethnic-related violent unrest in Xinjiang. We have reports of riots, of disturbances, of mobs storming government buildings towards the end of the decade, of some clashes with the security forces. However, what is interesting is at that time, the Chinese government did not make sense of Uyghur violence as terrorism or nor even separatism. So it understood ethnic violence in a much more moderate way as the result of existing structural social and economic inequalities that could be found elsewhere in China. And it gave a moderate response to it. Now, it is a period that in which we could say that instead of securitizing religion as an extremist ideological force, the Chinese government approached Islam as a natural ethnic identity feature of Turkic Muslims, and they were even, the minorities were even encouraged to live in accordance to their faith, as they wanted. Thousands of mosques were opened, pilgrimage to Mecca was allowed, etc. There was a religious and an identity revival in some levels, not huge, but some levels of moderate liberalization, to the extent that some Uyghurs still see this period of the 80s as a sort of a golden age. It was a good reception of these policies, as there was a good reception in the 50s. But this approach radically changed into steps. First one took place in the 90s, when China securitized broad manifestations of Uyghur political, cultural, and religious life. Those clubs that James was referring to, those were securitized, were perceived as forums where separatist ideologies could thrive. So we see the emergence also of discursive labels such as violent separatism, splitism, illegal religious activities, this sort of stuff. And the question we might pose is, well, did political violence have an impact in this shift, this first shift towards securitization? Well, in the first half of the 90s, there were a few high-profile violent incidents in Xinjiang, but they were rare. And the Chinese government, for the most part, did not publicize them, with the exception of the Baden riot in 1919 that James referred to. This was framed as both a counter-revolutionary rebellion, but also, interestingly, as an example of a sort of a holy war, which set a very interesting precedent related to what we see nowadays in the ways that the Chinese state has of representing all violent tensions in Xinjiang as a matter of global jihadism-inspired terrorism. So if we consider the nature and intensity of these events at the beginning of the 90s, well, they did not pose a particular insurgent threat to the stability of the region or to Chinese control of the region. And I think we should maybe pay attention to other developments, and I would include here the collapse of the Soviet Union, which involved other Turkic Muslim ethnic minorities having their own republics, other imperatives that have to do with regional economic development, or the need to search and exploit and natural resources such as oil, also cotton. I think all of that led China to halfway into the 90s to adopt a very explicitly, even from a discursive point of view, a securitization turn that included a harsh crackdown campaign, well, many of them, the strike hard campaigns against political, cultural, social and religious aspects of the Uyghur identity. And this crackdown has an immediate impact on the actual levels and intensity of the political violence in the region. I mean, it opened a cycle of repression, violent reaction, further repression, with dozens, even hundreds of violent episodes, including those riots in Gulja. And this was a situation that was only stabilized towards the turn of the century. And then 9/11 happened, 2001, and what we see here, it was already advanced before, is that very rapidly, in a matter of days, weeks, well, it was established in 2002, but already the first weeks following 9/11, China seizes the chance and retrospectively reframes all that violence of the 80s and the 90s, and even Xinjiang conflict before, or Uyghur political nationalism from the 40s, earlier in time, phenomena that had not been understood primarily as terrorism. All of a sudden they become a terrorist problem, and Xinjiang is set as China's front in the global war on terror. This is the moment where China's fight against terrorism, verbatim, starts in Xinjiang. And the interesting bit is that the pattern is repeated again. If during the 90s, the securitization of the Uyghurs and the crackdown that followed led to an increase in violent resistance to Chinese state, from 9/11 2001 onwards, we see an intensification of the gradual crackdown and repression that eventually, it's going to take a few years, but it's going to trigger eventually from 2008, and most notably from 2009 with the Urumqi riots, a second wave of violent unrest that will last roughly until 2017. This coincides in time with the latest shift towards an even more extreme emergency mode that entails mass internment of people in camps, all these active measures to somehow re-engineer and synthesize the Uyghurs and change also the demographic balance in the region, forced labor, etc. What we have seen over the news, basically, and also in lots of scholarly research very recently, over the past 2-3 years, and phenomena which are increasingly understood by Western scholars and legislatures as part of a sort of a genocidal action. I still think that we need to put these measures in perspective, because save for the mass internment in camps, the rest of the things that we have seen, in one way or another, to a lesser scale, of course, but still many of these measures have been ongoing, some from the second half of the 90s, and many others from 2001 onwards. What is interesting and remarkable also about this second wave of political violence is that even with the existing reporting constraints, journalistic constraints and censorship, we have much more information about the nature and the shape of this political violence. We have more data, more accounts, both official and alternative. We have a clearer picture of the phenomenon of political violence in Xinjiang. And what we see is that when you analyze violent conflict there, only a small part of the phenomenon can be understood as emerging at the organizational middle or at the individual level. And by this, I mean emerging from militant groups acting in the region, or sending cells infiltrating the region, or emerging from radicalization processes, becoming like the major force behind the actual violent incidents that we have seen. What causes, drives, or triggers most of the violent incidents seen in Xinjiang during this period, and I say incidents, because many of them are not even attacks, but reflect different patterns of violent interaction. Most of them can be explained because of structural and direct factors that include horizontal inequalities, feelings of relative deprivation, social injustice, human rights repression, feelings of dispossession. All of that lures in one way or another behind the most recent history of political violence. And this is a political violence that at the same time, only in a very small fraction of the recorded incidents, and contrary to Chinese official narratives, presents the features of terrorism as a tactic in the sense of organized, unpredictable, indiscriminate violence against civilians with a political insurgent motivation. This is not to say by any means that there have been no violent incidents, attacks, in which we can trace some sort of operational or inspirational role on the part of global or localized jihadi outlets, localized in Syria, such as the Turkestan Islamic Party, few scattered individuals either in Afghanistan or tribal areas in Pakistan. There have been such cases, and they show the traits of terror tactics, but as I say, they explain only very little of why a violent conflict happens in Xinjiang. So to conclude briefly my argument, political violence is a factor, but a minor one that helps us into understanding securitization in Xinjiang, which, as I have suggested earlier, can be traced to broader geopolitical imperatives related to a nationwide economic development, thirst for energy resources, the strategic position of Xinjiang in the country's opening to the West, most recently through the Belt and Road Initiative, and increasingly assimilationist, colonial-like plans, if we want, gain ground and currency within the party's ethnic policies towards Uyghurs and other ethnic minorities.
Pablo, thank you very much. You brought us right up to date. I think we have even more to talk about in this current period, so we'll come back to you shortly as well. But it'd be nice now to go across to Zhang and Chi as well, if you asked us to call you here. Could you talk to us about the perspective from inside China, perhaps? So obviously we all tend to look at problems from outside in rather than inside out. It would be nice from your own background, obviously, coming from the People's Republic of China, to tell us how you feel people in China perceive Xinjiang, how they perceive Uyghurs, and also from what you've written about in your academic study. Can you talk a little more about the nature of the Chinese Communist Party mass movements, a little bit historically perhaps, but also how these have expanded to Xinjiang? Because a lot of what we've seen in the past several years seem to be rather similar to some of the mass movements in the past. For example, government officials living with Uyghur families. That might seem quite, well, not quite unusual, very unusual, bizarre to Westerners perhaps, but there obviously is a history of this in mass line movements from the CCP. So could you explain your perspective on this?
Yes, thank you very, very much, Martin. And it's really an honor to be in the same panel with James and Pablo. And both of them have appeared frequently in my own work as well, as in the reference list. So as Martin mentioned, I'm going to approach this slightly different from how James and Pablo did. Because coming from a perspective of Chinese political studies, my research focuses more on how Chinese politics operate and how Chinese states operate in order to keep all these oppositions under control. So I think Martin raises a very good question. We don't hear often enough from this group, particularly on this issue, because of its sensitivity in China. And so I think that resulted in a situation where Chinese people, especially the Han Chinese, are often portrayed as cold, unfeeling, chauvinist, or subjects of repression waiting to be rescued, sometimes both. But I think it's there is a reason behind this. There is a reason why Chinese people feel so difficult to believe what is being said on Western media. And I think understanding that reason doesn't necessarily mean that we agree with them, but it's important to do that if we want to better engage them. So in China, the issue of Xinjiang obviously is intertwined very much with great power rivalry. It is, of course, primarily because it is how the state framed it, but also Chinese people are not completely isolated from the international internet, even though with the existence of the Great Firewall, and they have all sorts of tools to allow them to reach information outside. But the problem is the evidence they found outside is not very helpful to challenge the state narratives which is being formed in China. So, for example, the cases there has been a few cases of exaggerating the facts to appeal to those who believe in China threat discourse. Rune Steenberg wrote a very good piece on this. He argues that the alleged attention to eliminate a people is based on questionable interpretations of data, misquotes, and quotes being taken out of context. I can put the link later in the chat box if anyone need that. There is also a few cases of misuse of photos as evidence of China's treatment of Uyghurs in Xinjiang. For example, there was a little girl. Was a photo of a little girl crying, perhaps because of the reasons such as she didn't want to be taken to the kindergarten, and that photo was used as evidence of local authority separating the mother from her child and sending them to separate camps. Of course, these cases are by no means mean that all the evidence is questionable, but the actual consequences is that they did reinforce Chinese people's perception that the issue is more about great power rivalry rather than genuine concern about what happens in China. And these cases also validate Chinese government's claims about so-called double standards of Western governments and also undermine the credibility of their criticisms on human rights violations. The Xinjiang issue is not a standalone thing where the CCP just suddenly decided to up its control in the region. From my research, at least as early as 2015, there were already pivot projects at local level. For example, local schools collaborated with vocational training institutes to provide training for unemployed villagers. Most of them, of course, were Uyghurs. And at that time, the project was motivated mainly by economic incentives. So, for example, in one of the cases, if the trainee can go to the training center, they were given 2,000 Chinese yuan, which is equivalent to 230 pounds in the UK. It's not a lot of money, but it shows that at the beginning there were some experiments at the local level to try with this kind of job training and try to provide them with more job employability and try to solve the problem of inequalities, and especially inequality between Han Chinese and Uyghurs. And of course, as time went on, these cases, these small projects became larger in terms of the scale, and it became no longer feasible for the government to provide all the incentives for the implementation in the entire region. So later we saw that when carried out in such large scale, it became no longer feasible for economic incentives, and the whole program became increasingly coercive. And from in the broader perspective of Chinese politics, because of how Chinese politics operate, it became more and more coercive and expensive when the state policy is implemented at local levels. in this sense, counterterrorism policy is not so different from China's approach to COVID. So I'll try to explain them in parallel. Of course, the problem with terrorism definition and designation has already been discussed in detail by James and Pablo, so I won't dwell on that. So the terrorism and COVID seems to be two different, very different policy areas, but they do show the same rationale that as long as the masses of the people can be mobilized, there is nothing that cannot be done. So indeed, if we look at China's COVID cases, China is doing, the COVID cases are unbelievably low. But what we are seeing also aware is that it comes at a very high price, a very high expense of people's liberty. But many people in China actually support it and prefer to trade their liberties for zero COVID. So it is true that many people don't like their liberties to be taken away, but if you ask people on the street in China, they probably will point to terrorism cases in the West, and they probably point to how many people died of COVID in Western countries, and they reach the conclusion that they're more happy with their liberties being taken away. And both of these policy areas have their roots in China's mass mobilization approach, where the state, after state sketching out the macro level direction of the policy, local governments and communities then take over. And in order to be effective, they make the policies more coercive and expensive. For example, the state says travelers entering into China has to self-isolate for 7 days. And then the local governments and communities added more days to in compliance of that state policy. One case of COVID-19 or one case of terrorism will ruin the prospects of local government officials, but they won't necessarily get too much blame if they try to over-implement the state policies. I think that's what is at core of what is happening at the local level in terms of these two policy areas. So why is CCP's mass mobilization strategy working to the point where it is being called the magic weapon of the Communist Party? It is not simply because the CCP is meticulous in propaganda. In fact, we can see that in many cases, its propaganda is very poorly made and unconvincing, even to the Chinese eyes and ears. But it's effective because it is able to mobilize the majority who sincerely believe in it to counteract the opposing voices. This happens not only between Chinese, between Han and Uyghurs, but also between genders, between different ethnic groups, between even between those who are living in China and those Chinese diasporas hoping to return to China. So to summarize, first, mass mobilization in counterterrorism and counter-radicalization in Xinjiang is in line with China's rationale across China. So this is not a standalone case. It's not, I don't think it's entirely because of the ethnicity that Chinese government is implementing this kind of high-level pressure. And second, from the history of a pivot project, we can see that it is not because a few high-level officials one day suddenly decided to round up everybody because of their ethnicity. There has been a history of the experiments to try to increase the employability and solve the social inequality issue. And third, mass mobilization remains quite effective in CCP's treatment of both terrorism and COVID-19, at least from statistics. However, it does come at a very high price, a price that in many cases, Chinese people are willing to pay. So with that, I'll hand over back to Martin.
Chief, thank you very much. It's a difficult area, but I think this point of mass line movement and mass mobilization is important to think about. And I think your comparison to the mass mobilization in response to COVID-19 is interesting. So perhaps we could go back to James to give your views on this, because James, thinking of what this means for Xinjiang, what the securitization and mass movements mean in Xinjiang in comparison to what mass movements and the mass line approach mean in the rest of China for the Han Chinese population may be quite different. Has it gone wrong in Xinjiang? Because obviously with all due respect, Qi, in the core part of China, with a largely Han Chinese population, as you said, most people seem to accept this mass mobilization in response to an issue like COVID-19. So James, is the issue that obviously in Xinjiang most people would not accept, or certainly from the Uyghur population? Yeah.
So I think Dr. Zhang has described really well. Well, she would know better than I what, quote, most Chinese people think, and I don't pretend to be able to express that. But from my sense and from some reading and talking to people and really conversations over the years, not just recently, but with Chinese colleagues and friends whom I'm, very friendly with, Dr. Zhang has accurately conveyed their sense that there is a problem, there is unrest, the Uyghurs are not grateful, or they're separatists, something needs to be done. And there's a sense that this is a reasonable trade-off, right? That the securitization is solving the problem. Now, that sense comes from not really knowing the nature of what's going on and the vast exaggeration of the threat as terrorism, and the mischaracterization of the causes as religious, and religious extremism. And I've found this to be the case from Chinese social scientists, and even some writing outside of China, really do see that religion is breeding extremism, which is breeding unrest. And I think so. Pablo's analysis, I think, was useful in that way, and that sort of flips that around. But we're really not, the most important thing to recognize here is that we're not talking about religious people, really. We're not talking about even unemployable, ignorant peasants, really. I mean, one of the things which is not, the PRC narrative is that there are these potentially violent, unemployed, underskilled people from southern Xinjiang, who need vocational training, right? That's the argument. But what they're not talking about is among the very first people to be disappeared when these campaigns began, either into camps or into prisons, were the elites. And academic, intellectual, artistic, commercial, even party members were all sent away. And there are people documenting this. And I mentioned this man, well, I won't go into this, but there was a whole controversy about textbooks in the, I believe the controversy came out in 2015, 2016. So saying that terrorist ideas have been put into the textbooks, and the textbook editors were arrested, and one was condemned to death for this. The things that these were all approved textbooks that had gone through the political system. These were Uyghur language textbooks for schools. And one of the things that they point to in saying that terrorism has infiltrated society is mention of this man, Ahmadjan Qasimi, whom I talked about before, one of the leaders of the Eastern Turkestan Republic, who had in fact been a hero of the revolution, the revolutionary martyr, with a memorial to him in northern Xinjiang in the past. And so what we're seeing here is a really Stalinist style rewriting of history in a very short period of time, within just a few years, and then massive cracking down on anyone who still knows and can spread that vision of the past, and that idea that China is a multinational state as opposed to a state of Chinese, that is Zhonghua Chinese people. So the assimilation trend, the pivot has happened quickly, and it has had very dire effects on elites as well, and in particular on elites.
Yeah. No, thanks, James. I think that's a really important point to bring out, as you said, about the people who were first subject to the crackdown when it began. This comes on to why it started to happen at that time. We have a couple of questions from the audience members. Obviously, many members of the Royal Society for Asian Affairs have traveled in Central Asia. and have alluded to that in some of the points they've made. In fact, I was in Xinjiang in 2016, and it's an extraordinarily beautiful place, as I'm sure Peter McKinnon and Adam Tyndale found as well when they travelled there. But I think that was shortly before the security situation or securitization started to change. And Pablo came onto this earlier. So Pablo, perhaps could you say something about why did it change? What was the driver? I mean, 9/11 was still quite a few years before 2017-18. Why did the securitization change so drastically at that point? Obviously, we know that the party secretary, who's just leaving Xinjiang, came from Tibet, and his strategy in Tibet, from a party perspective, seemed to work particularly well in a downturn in self-immolations, for example, and protests in Tibet. So why was he allowed to carry out a very different policy in Xinjiang to what may have been carried out before? What changed, do you think, and why did the attitude of the government change?
Sorry, I'm not on mute. No, yeah. Well, when we look into those, I think that the Urumqi riots had a strong impact. First, that's a very important event that certainly puts Xinjiang in the global radar, if you want. But then still there are a few years until 2014, when Beijing declares a people's war on terror. I think there is also a feeling that economic avenues just don't work to halt all sort of violent unrest. But again, I think that the main issue here is the exaggeration of the situation. It's true that there are a few serious incidents towards 2013, 2014, but we had seen similar incidents that we could describe as terrorist attacks in 2008. For instance, we saw an attack against a border patrol, a group of police officers, like I think that around 20 of them were killed in actual insurgent tactics. And there was no reaction at that time of, oh, we're going to intern like vast amounts of the population, of the Uyghur population into camps. I think we need to go into very, very a higher level of decision making within the Communist Party. A change there around 2014 to 2016. And that's why I was referring to wider schemes related to first geopolitical considerations that were always there, but I think that what we see clearly here is a change in the ethnic policies that have across history oscillated between an assimilationist pools and some sort of an attempt to provide some autonomy. And I think that what we see now is a drive for a different type of solution, which certainly entails changing and eroding in the first place the Uyghur identity and turn it into something else. This is not only about the economy, it's not only about the economic development, it's not even only about religion, I think. It goes well beyond religion, it's about culture. These individuals that James was mentioning before, I always put the example of Ilham Tohti, currently in prison with a life sentence, a person who, a scholar teaching in a university in Beijing for years, offering very, very fine analysis of the root causes of violent unrest. A person openly confronting existing jihadist groups or movements, within the region, or tendencies, we would say, to be more exact. And Ilham Tohti was allowed to come up with his discourse. His discourse was part of the debate. And all of a sudden, we go from there, from having a bridge between the Uyghurs and the state, if we want. And in 2014, we see a totally unreasonable sentence, life sentence for what it really doesn't sound logically by any means as accusations of terrorism or separatism towards Ilham Tohti. So we see some sort of again, I say change in the higher political echelons of the Communist Party towards basically changing, the system, the ethnic policies of the country, and into a broader, a stronger assimilationist scheme. I think that explains much of what we've seen before. And after that, that's when we see that Zhang Chunxiang is replaced by Chen Chongguo later, and that's clearly another sign that, well, we're going to go for much more harder policies, and we are going to basically go and crack on the identity and change it, and that's where we see all this indoctrination. These schools, they are not only about providing employment or training. There is more than that, and that has to do more with culture, identity, and with changing, not gaining, changing the hearts and minds of the people.
Yep. Thank you, Pablo. Chi, we're going to keep going a little bit longer. Michael has just signaled that we can, obviously some people may drop off, but we still have quite a few people on, and we'd like to get some questions in from the audience. So if I could put a couple of questions to you and try and pull them together. So from Michael Burton, he's asked, is Beijing's approach to governing Xinjiang very different from its approach to Tibet? And if so, why? I'd just like to pull that in with a question from Adam Tyndale, who has asked, to what extent is the current CCP policy in Xinjiang linked with foreign and economic development policy in Central Asia? It's given a very good follow-up question to sort of round off the event, probably, into what extent is liberty and security beyond China's borders becoming a zero-sum game as a result? So from a Chinese perspective, could you talk to us about both of these questions, and why is Xinjiang important to China? Why, for example, would the Chinese state, PRC, not allow secessionism in Xinjiang? Is the harsh response to the situations in Xinjiang and Tibet deliberately intended to prevent any suggestion of secessionism? So obviously we're not just talking about terrorism and extremism, but separatism is the third word that's most commonly used by PRC officials: terrorism, separatism, extremism. So separatism seems to be a key part of what drives the government response. Could you talk a little bit about how the government sees Xinjiang in that sense?
Yes, sure. I think those are very good questions. So in terms of Beijing's responses, Beijing's approaches to both Xinjiang and Tibet, I'm not an expert on Tibet policies, but from what my research tells me, I think Beijing is very concerned about sovereignty, its sovereign over territorial integrity and national unity. These three things are very essential to its foreign policies. So it's not only about Xinjiang, but also all its peripherals, including Hong Kong and other areas, other regions where there are territorial disputes, including some regions in South China Sea. I think it is related to how the Chinese government consider the ability of other countries to conduct some kind of like peaceful evolution activities to overthrow it eventually. Of course, this is the perspective of the Chinese government. I think it's, for example, in one of my papers, I think I did some digging into how Chinese government perceive the separatism in Tibet, and a lot of the documents mentioned CIA's involvement in Tibet in trying to separate Tibet from China. And I think these cases makes China very worried about separation will eventually lead to the eventual collapse of the entire Chinese nation, just like the Soviet Union did. So also the experience of so-called color revolution, and also the cases of Ukraine and other countries near Russia also gives China a lot of reasons to worry about its territorial integrity around these neighboring countries. I hope that answers part of the questions.
It does, and I think it comes on very nicely also to a question from William Crawley, which, if you don't mind, James, we'll put back to you again. And William Crawley has asked, does the so-called century of humiliation, fundamental to China's historical narrative for the years between 1839 and 1949, have as much relevance to mainstream perception of the status of Xinjiang as that of Tibet? And James, alluding to what Chi said as well, is there an inherent worry in Chinese senior leadership about the entire stability of the state, the fractioning of the Chinese state? Is this why there's such a harsh response in Xinjiang and elsewhere?
I'm not a security studies expert, but my sense is that there isn't any real threat, either from foreign parties or from separatists, of breaking up China. However, as you say, and as the questioner very rightly suggests, the narrative of a century of humiliation is very much about that threat in the past, right? The idea that imperialist powers want to carve up China like a melon. And indeed, the U.S. in the early Cold War was, meddling around and causing trouble in Tibetan highlands and training guerrillas in Colorado. There was some very little involvement in Xinjiang in 1948, 1949 with a then OSS agent from the Urumqi consulate when the U.S. had a consulate there, who was talking, sorry, they're banging outside, who was talking to a Kazakh leader and telling him to resist the communists. So, this is all quite in the past, but it's part of this narrative. And as I believe it was Dr. Zhang and Pablo both said, geopolitical factors and this discourse is part of how these issues are understood, I think, by both the leadership and I think many people too, right? So it's important to understand the threat perception of Chinese leadership, but I think it's also important to understand to what extent that threat perception is wrong or is paranoid, and also to what extent it's also really a reflection of domestic concerns about legitimacy. And so the territorial issues such as Hong Kong, such as Taiwan and Xinjiang and Tibet have all become, they rank very, very high on the CCP's list of how it demonstrates its legitimacy, how it demonstrates its greatness. So I think we have to remember all those things at once.
I think that's a perfect summary at the end. Thank you very much. That really highlights perhaps the key driver of Central People's Government response. Could I give one closing question, as Michael has allowed us to stay on just for a little bit? Pablo, perhaps you'd like to say something about, and I'm sorry, not as a historian, but a futurist. Where does this go next? I mean, we've seen huge scale incarcerations or training camps. Let's be careful with words, but we've seen allegations of serious abuses of human rights. Clearly, the local Uyghur population in Xinjiang is not likely to be, you would think, more submissive to Chinese authority, or more docile, or more happy with Chinese authority. So where does this go next? Because it's not a small population, around 10, 11 million Uyghurs, I think. How do you see the future developing in Xinjiang?
Well, I think that it will all depend on the Chinese Communist Party again. And in this sense, I just wanted to reiterate that it doesn't have to be this way. We go back to the 80s. It was the very same Chinese Communist Party that offered some sort of autonomy, certain levels of freedom, without embracing liberal democracy or anything similar. So it will depend on the Chinese Communist Party if they want to go back to a perfectly feasible avenue that the Chinese Communist Party had already done in the past. So we'll have to see future developments in the leadership. But I think it's important to to note that this is evitable, and these levels of repression that we have seen over the past few years, it didn't have to happen that way. So basically a shift in the interpretation of what an ethnic minority entails, a clear, rigorous assessment of the role that separatism, or very small role, I would say, and that was my argument, that separatism in the sense of pro-independence movement or jihadism play in violent unrest in the first place, and again, a change in the broader schemes of what policies the party wants for the ethnic minorities, that would be fundamental. You could take that a turning point there to see something different. Otherwise, that I think the actual situation is, as I call it, is a perpetual state of terroristization, or Xinjiang is a securitized region where atmospheres of security are basically affecting all orders of life.
Pablo, thank you very much. James, thank you also from California. Zhang from New York, thank you very much. Could I hand back to you, Michael, for the closing?
And let me thank all of you again, Jim, Chi, Pablo, Martin. It has been an outstanding discussion. If anyone in the audience wants to revisit any of it, you will be able to see a recording of the whole event on the RSAA YouTube channel within the next 24 hours. And you'll find the link in the chat channel here during the webinar now. If you'd like a transcript of the event, please email events@rsaa.org.uk. Transcripts are free to members of the Society and available to non-members for a small charge. In my introduction, I alluded to the current tensions over Ukraine. Ukraine is, of course, not an Asian country, but the situation there is being closely watched around the world, and whether it evolves into a live conflict or simply a drawn-out diplomatic process, countries across Asia are watching with interest and drawing their own conclusions. Next week, we will be holding a panel discussion on those Asian perceptions of the Ukraine crisis, addressing both geostrategic questions and energy policy. The details of that event will be announced in the next 24 hours, so please watch your email inboxes for that. And for now, it remains for me simply to thank our speakers again, and you, our audience, for joining us today. I hope that we will see many of you again next week. Goodbye.